A Canadian third world. That's how one author describes Indian reserves in Canada. He says sweeping changes are needed. Now.
Fraser TV. Here's Leah Costello.
Gordon Gibson says the problems facing Indians in Canada are the result of failed government policy, and he argues that the fate of Indians within Canada is the most important question in federal politics today. His latest book, A New Look at Canadian Indian Policy, says Canada's current policy towards Indians is morally wrong. His suggestion for fixing the problem? Stop treating Indians as a parallel society and start treating them as individuals. And Gordon Gibson joins us right now in the Fraser studios. Mr. Gibson, time and again your book comes back to the idea of the collective versus the individual. I'm wondering if you can explain that difference.
The message of this book is one of common sense and hope. And the common sense part is that Indians are ordinary human beings just like the rest of us. And that also is the hope part. In our approach to Indian policy, from the very time the British first landed in North America, it has been a government-to-government, nation-to-nation, diplomatic, military, collective kind of relationship. The military usefulness of Indians ended in 1812, after the war that year. And after that, a new policy was adopted by the British, which some call assimilation, but it really was isolation. These folks are on some very desirable real estate. How can we move them out of the way and get on with our business of developing this continent? And that's what happened. It was almost a thoughtless kind of policy. So you can't say it came about in a deliberate sort of fashion. There was no particular planning here. It was just the way things worked. Then in 1867, when Canada was created, 1867 was a good year for Canada. It was also a time when it was run by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, who look a lot like me. And women were inferior, and Catholics were inferior, and Jews and Chinese and Indians, everybody was inferior. But the Constitution of Canada in that year only segregated out one class of people, and that was Indians. 140 years later, women are fine, Catholics are fine, Jews, Chinese are fine. Indians have still got a big problem. And putting them in the Constitution in that way has been the center of that problem because it made it possible, first of all, a different kind of citizenship, a citizenship facing Ottawa rather than like the mainstream facing your town and your province. And it made it possible to pass laws saying that they could take away your kids, force you to change your language, lock you up on a reserve. None of these things would have been possible had we not had that clause in our Constitution.
So throughout the book you use the phrase Indian instead of Aboriginal, First Nation, or Native.
Indian has a very precise meaning in law, and this book is about status Indians. It's not about Aboriginals. Aboriginal is a fuzzy word which is used by Statistics Canada for their census purposes when they say, do you consider yourself to be of Aboriginal heritage? 1.2 million Canadians say yes. But then there's a much more specific thing. Are you a status Indian? Is your name entered on the big computer disk in Ottawa that says you are a legal Indian? And in that case, there are different laws applicable to you and different rights applicable to you, different financial incentives, and so on. And that is what this book is about. It is about status Indians. It's a word that if you use it, it reminds you every time you use it, hey, there's a question here, and it's a question that we've created, that we're responsible for. And it makes you think about that every time you use that word.
One of your more ambitious ideas, and I found this fascinating, is the concept that you call treaty money. And the idea is to redirect government money away from the band chiefs and the councils directly to the individuals, both on and off reserve. I'm wondering if you can explain the concept and the purpose of this, and also what you feel this would accomplish.
The idea came from a guy named Jean Allard, who's a Métis in Winnipeg, was once parliamentary secretary to Ed Schreier. Jean wrote a book called Big Bear's Treaty. Big Bear was a great Indian leader. Each Indian was entitled to $5 per year, which was a sum of money in those days. As the Lard says, then an acre of land was worth about $5, and each Indian got $5. He said now, 100 years later, or whatever it is, an acre of land's worth $5,000. So we ought to change what each Indian gets to $5,000. That's the genesis of the idea. When you get more deeply into it, the thought is, look, if you took a chunk of this money that you're currently giving to chiefs and councils for their exclusive disposition as they wish, and gave it instead to the Indians, who then elect the chief and council, then the electors, the voters, might be a lot more concerned about how their money is used.
So in your book, you also spend some time discussing Calvin Helene, who we hosted here at the Fraser Institute a few months ago on the concept of self-governance. And in his ideas, he calls for an outright rejection of government funding. Is there a point in which you and Calvin Helene disagree on what should be done to help reform policy in Canada?
Well, I'm an admirer of Calvin. I make no bones about it. I have taken, very honestly, a softer approach. He's perhaps entitled to take a harder approach. I mean, he is himself a status Indian. He can say, whatever you think of me, this is my moral ground, and I'm entitled to speak like this. I'm speaking as an outsider, much more deferentially than Calvin does. What I'm really trying to do is say to people, look, let's think about this question in a different way.
In one chapter, you discuss the situation of the Saskatchewan band in northern Ontario, and also the government's recommendation that band members be moved to a completely different urban area to escape the abject living conditions in the remote location that they were in. And this included an abysmal, unsafe drinking water supply. This didn't happen, and I'm wondering if you can discuss what we can learn from this situation.
I'm afraid what we can learn from it is the difficulty of changing anything. What you described was correct. There was an unsafe drinking water supply. A consultant was sent in. The consultant did an extensive survey, found that there was something like 1,500 to 2,000 people there. Nobody was quite sure. 1,700 is what the consultant settled on. Found that the education, health, policing, housing, job possibilities, everything was just in absolutely wretched shape. And a lot of it came back to this particular location. So the consultant in his report said, what would you think of moving to some ground down south a bit, a few hundred kilometers, near to Timmins? And the consultant claimed in his report that he got 90% plus approval of this. The band elites say, well, maybe we better take our own survey. They said, we got a 95% approval on that. The lack of transparency and the inability to really know what the individuals wanted to do just shut the whole exercise down, and those poor folks are still there in a place where there's no jobs, and there's going to be flooding every year and so on. And but it's the dilemma of politicians when they face questions in this area. Because if you try and challenge what I call the Indian system, which is that complex of Indian elites and lawyers and academics and so on that run these things, if you try and challenge them on an ideological base, you're going to get nothing but grief, and the media is going to give you nothing but grief. And therefore, as a politician, by far your simplest solution is how much money will it cost to make this thing quiet?
And that brings me to the most important question. The changes that you say are necessary on both an economic as well as a moral level are extraordinarily difficult to implement and require a tremendous amount of effort, not only cooperating from players on the inside, but also outside of the political system. How much confidence do you really have that the system can be corrected and that Indians can see a time when they would live normal and happy lives?
I say in my book that the most likely thing that happens is that nothing will happen. That is the unfortunate truth. That's what generations have taught us. All I'm saying is, please, if you look at it this way, something might happen. but that's the best I can do for you.
Gordon Gibson, thank you for sitting down with us. You can find a link to buy Gordon Gibson's new book on our website, and there you'll also find an interview with Calvin Helene that we mentioned previously. The address is www.fraserinstitute.org. That's it for this edition of Fraser TV. I'm Leah Costello. Thanks for tuning in.